An incredible operation by the soldiers of the pro-Ukrainian Russian Legion of Freedom, the soldiers of the Russian Freedom Legion, who managed to capture two different towns in the city of Belgorod, located within the borders of Russia in recent weeks, have now captured the Russian army headquarters in Belgorod. Russian soldiers assigned to prevent pro-Ukrainian soldiers from entering the city center of Belgorod were forced to surrender to the soldiers of the Russian Legion of Freedom by showing a white flag. The soldiers of the Freedom Legion, who managed to capture the town of Grave-Oransky in Belgorodsky and Belgorod in recent weeks, managed to repel all the Russian forces there. The pro-Ukrainian soldiers who managed to capture the town of Graveron after the town of Kazanka began to make a show of their bodies by seizing armored vehicles and tanks belonging to the Russian army. The Ukrainian soldiers who managed to capture the T-72 model tanks used by the Russian army began to send these tanks to the border area to ensure the border security of the town they had captured. The commander of the Ukrainian troops organizing the operation said in a statement that they will continue to move forward in order for Ukraine to regain independence and end the occupation of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory. Vladimir Putin, who began to become agitated when the Ukrainian army also began to advance into Russia's borders, took action to increase security measures in the city center of Belgorod. Acting on Putin's orders, Russian General Staff Chief Valery Gerasimov decided to send more troops to the Russian headquarters in Golovkino, Belgorod. After the Ukrainian intelligence service determined that more Russian troops would be sent to this region, Ukrainian troops in the city of Graveron began preparations for an operation to prevent the arrival of Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian army, which moved to capture the military base of the Russian army in the city of Golovkino, began to advance towards the city of Golovkino along with tanks and armored vehicles. Russian soldiers who were waiting for a support team unaware of everything were surprised by what they suffered when they saw the Ukrainian army in front of them. The Ukrainian army kept the Russian headquarters under artillery fire from a distance with tanks. The Ukrainian soldiers who started shelling the headquarters with mortars installed around the headquarters tried to get the Russian soldiers to leave the headquarters. The Ukrainian army advancing towards the headquarters with tanks put a blockade around the headquarters with tanks, Ukrainian soldiers who organized reconnaissance flights with drones to find out the number of Russian soldiers stationed at the headquarters took action to seize the headquarters when they found that the number of Russian soldiers inside the headquarters was small. After the delay of the support units sent by Russian General Gerasimov, Russian soldiers could not prevent the Ukrainian army's offensive as the Ukrainian soldiers approached the headquarters. Some of the Russian soldiers began to leave the headquarters after hours of clashes. Russian soldiers stopped responding to the Ukrainian army. Russian forces, short of ammunition, had no choice but to surrender to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers who hung a white flag in front of the army building located in the headquarters decided to surrender to the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers quickly gained entry to the headquarters and took the surrendering Russian soldiers prisoner. As a result of the operation, more than 70 Russian soldiers surrendered, while it was learned that 23 Russian soldiers lost their lives during the interrogation of the captured Russian soldiers. It was learned that more than 200 Russian soldiers were stationed at the headquarters, and more than half of these soldiers had to leave the headquarters. The commander of the Ukrainian troops said in a statement made on the Telegram channel that the captured 4 armored vehicles and 1 T-72 model Russian tank. According to information obtained from regional sources, after Ukrainian soldiers captured the Russian headquarters, they began placing mines at the entrance of the town in order to ensure the security of the town. The Ukrainian army, which wants to prevent the Russian army from making a new attack on this town, aims to slow down the progress of the Russian army with the mines they have placed. At the same time, a large number of Ukrainian soldiers were deployed to abandoned buildings in areas near the entrance to the town. It has been learned that Ukrainian soldiers stationed in the city of Kharkiv will also soon enter the borders of Russia and settle in these towns captured by pro-Ukrainian Russian Legion of Freedom soldiers. The fact that the war that has been going on the territory of Ukraine for almost 17 months has suddenly spilled over into Russia's borders has started to make Vladimir Putin very nervous. After the Wagner army attempted a coup in Russia, Vladimir Putin seems to have started having quite a difficulty controlling the army. The Ukrainian army continues to deal successive blows to Putin by turning the internal deceptions occurring in Russia into an opportunity and conducting large-scale operations both on the territory of Ukraine and within the borders of Russia. Belarusian border police eliminated 72 Russian soldiers. Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, has gone insane in the Kremlin. There is considerable animosity between Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin's recognized ally, Sergei Shoigu. While the entire world awaits the conclusion of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, fascinating news is emerging from the battlefield. Russian forces stationed on Ukrainian territory have lost their forbearance as the war's violence has begun to escalate. Russian soldiers who could no longer withstand the brutality of the war began to create problems within the army. Belarusian border police murdered Russian servicemen stationed on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border after launching an invasion of Ukraine. One of the first acts Russian President Vladimir Putin did was meet with the mercenary organization Wagner. Wagner mercenaries were dispatched to areas of Ukrainian territory where the Russian army was insufficient by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the creator of the Wagner mercenary organization and a close ally of Vladimir Putin. Consequently, the Russian army's burden has been halved. Although the Wagner soldiers secured significant advantages for Russia on Ukrainian territory, they ultimately contributed to the emergence of even greater problems. Wagner forces played a significant role in Russia's conquest of Soledar last month. As is well known, according to Prigozhin, the founder of Wagner, combatants conquered Soledar at every turn, and Wagner forces displayed ferocity in this region. This is because Prigozhin desires to control Soledar's subterranean mines. After obtaining complete control of Soledar, Prigozhin dispatched a large number of Wagner soldiers to the city in order to maintain his authority. However, after some time, these soldiers caused a significant disturbance in Soledar. A small number of minority soldiers in Soledar and Wagner personnel share the same headquarters. Because the vast majority of Wagner soldiers are convicted criminals, it is exceedingly difficult to command Wagner soldiers. When Wagner soldiers began to misbehave, he began to intimidate the minority soldiers fighting with the Russian army. Wagner soldiers viewed minority soldiers as second-class citizens, causing an uproar within the headquarters. Minority soldiers who were harassed by Wagner soldiers were expelled from the city of Soledar because there were no problems at the headquarters. The director of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, issued an order to disperse the minority of soldiers stationed at the Russian headquarters in Soledar to other districts. However, after a period of time, Wagner soldiers began to cause problems at multiple Ukrainian commands. One of these offices is located in the Ukrainian city of Varish, which is situated on the Belarusian frontier. President Vladimir Putin has led a large number of Russian troops across the Belarusian border and into Ukrainian territory where they have occupied multiple districts. Russia, which has established a headquarters in the occupied territories, has dispatched a significant number of Wagner and Chechen personnel to ensure the safety of these regions. Long serving in the Varish region, these soldiers were unable to withstand the harsh conditions imposed by the conflict, culminating in a massive riot within the headquarters as a result of Vladimir Putin's deployment of Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. Food and medication were denied to Chechen soldiers, causing them to lose their tempers. While the Russian and Wagner forces at the headquarters had no difficulty meeting their basic needs, only 1 or 2 meals per day could be served to the Chechen soldiers. The vast majority of provisions delivered to headquarters is allocated to Wagner Commander Zone forces. Concerned by the situation, Chechen, Russian, and Wagner soldiers engaged in combat. The Russian officers intended to arrest the disobedient and disorderly soldiers who were producing issues within the headquarters. However, 72 Russian soldiers utilized the confusion to flee the headquarters in secret. Russian soldiers stationed near to the Belarusian border in Varish believed they could leave Ukrainian territory via the Belarusian border. Belarusian border guardians detected Russian forces that managed to approach the Belarusian border region. The Russian forces raced towards the Belarusian border at the risk of their lives. Ignoring the demands of Belarusian soldiers to halt, Belarusian border guards were compelled to intervene, however, because the Russian soldiers refused to stop running. 58 soldiers were injured and 14 were slain when border guards opened fire on the Russian military. The Belarusian soldiers were at a loss for action when they realized the forces they had opened fire on were Russian personnel. The Belarusian soldiers notified their superiors and transported the wounded Russian soldiers to Belarus for treatment. 11 of the Russian soldiers who began undergoing treatment at the hospital are in critical condition. According to reports, the assault on Russian soldiers by Belarusian border police precipitated a significant problem in Russia between Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Russian President Vladimir Putin. There has been considerable animosity. Putin has ordered the arrest of Russian servicemen who refuse to fight on Ukrainian soil and attempt to escape the front lines. Sergei Shoigu, on the other hand, believes that initiative in this field should be rewarded. Previously, the news that Russian soldiers fleeing the battlefield had been killed by Wagner commanders had caused a worldwide uproar. Aware of the situation, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated that Russian soldiers who feared for their lives and fled to the Belarusian frontier were attacked by their allies. Shoigu, who has stated that Belarus is a Russian ally and should not attempt an attack on the Russian military, desires that the Belarusian government be punished for this. However, it appears that Vladimir Putin is of a different opinion. Putin, who stated that Russian soldiers who attempted to flee received the punishment they deserved, believes that strict rules should be instituted to ensure order and stability in the Russian army and that punishments should be endured if these rules are violated. Putin and Shoigu do not agree on this issue. Shoigu believes that sanctions should be imposed on the Belarusian government, whereas Vladimir Putin believes that the attack by the Belarusian army was justifiable. This disagreement between Shoigu and Putin prompted complications within the Kremlin deck. The rift between the two forces has also divided Kremlin officials into factions. However, because Putin always has the final word, Sergei Shoigu and his supporters are irrelevant. Russian President Vladimir Putin's autocratic tendencies have elicited a broad range of responses. When the Russian army entered Ukrainian territory, Vladimir Putin began to make his own decisions. One of these options is selective mobilization. Before the Russian army attacked Ukrainian territory, Putin failed to keep his promise that this occupation would last for many days and that no Russian soldiers would be hurt in Ukraine. The Russian army has sustained over 160,000 casualties since the beginning of the conflict. The fact that the Russian military has incurred so many casualties fuels the anger of the Russian people towards Putin. However, according to the Russian government, the losses of the Russian army are not significant. The Ukrainian government discloses the losses of both the Ukrainian and Russian armies each month. Vladimir Putin, however, refuses to disclose military losses, alleging that this information is a state secret that must be protected. Despite the fact that Russians who lack access to accurate information on the war are endeavoring to learn what is happening in Ukraine through independent news sources, access to these sites is currently blocked for Russians since the beginning of the war. Vladimir Putin has blocked over 200,000 websites that report on the conflict in Russia, denying the Russian people access to accurate information. Putin has literally humiliated the entire planet. Putin was driven insane by the stupidity of the Russian military. He couldn't even rationalize it. It has been established that even Ukrainian villager performance exceeds that of the Russian military. This Ukrainian peasant action reverberated around the globe. Putin received another blow from the peasantry, demonstrating the military strength of Russia. Putin, who is ridiculed around the globe, lacks even the fortitude to make a statement. Russia raided the villages in the Kharkiv region, where Russian occupation persisted during the Ukrainian conflict, and the local Ukrainian villagers repelled the Russian force with remarkable bravery. This operation, which would be conducted in the villages of Kharkiv, was intended to seize property belonging to Ukrainian locales. When the Russian forces first approached these regions, he did not anticipate any opposition. The valiant Ukrainian people astonished the world by exhibiting resistance that the Russian army had not anticipated for the planned looting attempts in Kharkiv villages. Russian forces selected a central region and established a Russian headquarters so that the troops could congregate and remain in this location. This headquarters was well armed and armored, despite the fact that numerous soldiers and the Ukrainian army should be able to initiate a counterattack. Although it was not anticipated that these weapons would be used against the locals, the Ukrainian army responded to the invasion by taking precautions against plundering in the villages. This headquarters, which contained a large number of armored vehicles and munitions, was located in close proximity to the village of Burova in the city of Kharkiv. The initial plundering was anticipated to occur in the village of Burova, followed by the plundering of adjacent villages and the forcible collection of goods from other villages in the Kharkiv region in preparation for the looting operation. Russian soldiers began constructing temporary barracks by erecting tents near the Burova settlement. Burova residents hid during the installation of the headquarters, hearing the sounds of armored vehicles and a large number of military personnel, and began gathering intelligence for the Ukrainian army. The young men of the community set out late at night to ascertain the exact location and proximity of this headquarters to the village. The youth of Burova informed the village supervisor that the location of this headquarters was approximately 2 kilometers distant. The local supervisor was dispatched to provide the Ukrainian army with this information. The construction of a Russian headquarters so near to the settlement alarmed the entire community. The villager, who uncovered the location of the Karagak, provided intelligence to the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military responded swiftly to safeguard its people. The Ukrainian army's exhaustive preparations were interrupted by an unforeseen event. The villagers informed the military headquarters that the uprising had begun and that plundering could commence within the next few hours. Despite the fact that the Ukrainian army had already departed after obtaining this information, it would take at least 5 hours to reach the communities. In response to this intelligence, the villagers organized to repel the planned plundering assault. The villagers, weighing their options, lacked sufficient firearms and ammunition for this resistance. Therefore, they decided to prolong the intended looting until Ukrainian forces could catch up. The villagers, who lacked the requisite equipment for this resistance, came to an agreement. This decision was made to ensure that the young people who set out to gather intelligence this time obtained access to the Russian headquarters at the cost of their lives and were equipped with sufficient munitions and explosives for resistance. 6 adolescent peasants infiltrated the headquarters in the dead of night while lugging their backpacks. They possessed no means of defense against the Russian invasion. Many villagers would be spared if the peasant youths successfully entered the headquarters, gathered sufficient ammunition, and fled. 6 youths who chose to abandon their lives had arrived at the headquarters to prevent being spotted by the Russian soldiers guarding the headquarters. They decided to wait until the change of guard. The village youth, unaware of when the guard would be changed, realized he needed to act promptly. The young people had reached the point where they could infiltrate the headquarters within an hour of the guard change. If the guard change did not occur, they would leave the work to chance. The patient peasant youths observed that the changing of the guard had begun before an hour had elapsed. Unnoticed by the scouts, they made their way to the location where the headquarters stored the ammunition. As soon as the change of security began, 16 young men and women who had begun loading their backpacks with explosives and ammunition had reached the most crucial phase of the operation. This objective was to be able to exit the headquarters in the same unobserved manner as they had entered. The young people who had packed their belongings began to leave in ranks from an open area where the spotters could not see them. Individually, the 6 peasant boys who had reached the point where they could no longer see the headquarters returned to their villages. When they returned to their settlements, they emptied their luggage of a large quantity of ammunition, firearms, and remote-controlled explosives to defend their community from Russian invaders intent on plundering and to fight until the Ukrainian army arrived. The villagers devised an incredible plan. A large bridge could provide Burovo residents with mobility. According to his plan, the villagers would detonate remote-controlled explosives when they arrived at the village's entrance bridge to plunder, delaying the entry of Russian troops and ensuring the arrival of Ukrainian forces. The villagers who were aware that Russian forces were preparing to act immediately initiated their plan to prevent armored vehicles from entering the village from the Russian headquarters. Explosives were concealed beneath the entrance bridge. As the suspenseful wait persisted, the lights of Russian military vehicles coming for plundering began to emerge from behind the hill. Everyone in the village entered their dwellings. Few courageous villagers remained to detonate the explosives. Russian armored vehicles arrived at the bridge, putting an end to the patient delay. The explosives were remotely detonated. Both the bridge and the armored vehicles that were stationed on it were obliterated. Upon seeing this, Russian troops opened fire on the settlement. Following the bridge, Ukrainian civilians deterred Russian personnel from entering their communities by detonating numerous additional explosions. Ukrainian peasants who recognize they cannot afford the army that will return to steal in a few hours. He observed the Ukrainian army approaching when Ukrainian personnel arrived in the area. They were astounded by what they saw. The Ukrainians and their supplies remained unharmed in the village from which they had retreated, convinced that their pursuers would not catch up. When the Ukrainian military learned of the residents' plot, they anticipated the return of the Russian army the next time Russian invaders arrived. Ukrainian troops would ambush them, utterly thwarting the planned plundering attempt in the Kharkiv region, as well as the planned assault on the headquarters. The Ukrainian army set up an ambush on the road above the settlement. The ambush is powerful. Armament was capable of neutralizing the Russian forces. Armored vehicles, heavy cannons were prepared to fire at Russian armored vehicles. Heavy cannons were prepared to fire at Russian armored vehicles. As soon as the Ukrainian soldiers realized that the Russian invaders had returned to the hamlet, they opened fire in the most advantageous location and completely repulsed the Russian army around the settlement and the village after initiating a significant pursuit. Ukrainian forces were able to eliminate Russian soldiers whom they pursued into the headquarters. The complete international press covered these events. Zelensky paid a visit to the citizens of Burovo who ensured that the valiant Ukrainian people would never again witness their power. He admired their organization of the sprinkling operation. He thanked them and added that because of their patriotism, the conflict would be won. Putin realized after this opera how incompetent his troops and himself were. Putin is at a loss for what to do as the Russian military has become a source of international ridicule. Putin continues to introduce new ones despite his previous failures. While their incompetence at each stage of the conflict was reflected in the agenda, Putin offered no explanation. The Ukrainian army has destroyed the greatest ammunition depot of the Russian army in the Belgorod region. The Ukrainian army conducted an air operation that resulted in the destruction of the Russian headquarters from which ammunition was delivered to Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian forces have prepared a significant offensive to dislodge Russian forces from the Kharkiv region, which they held in the early months of the conflict. After the Russian army captured Kharkiv, this region served as a distribution center for shipments of soldiers, weapons, and ammunition to Russian forces on Ukrainian soil. The initial shipment of equipment to Kharkov originates from the Russian ammunition depot in Belgorod, which is located within Russia's borders. Ammunition and weapons are transported to Kharkov and disseminated from there to regions seized by Russian troops. The Ukrainian intelligence service was able to identify the Russian headquarters to which weapons and ammunition transferred from Belgorod were conveyed. The Ukrainian military conducted a massive operation to obliterate the Russian ammo depot discovered near Belgorod. Although Russian personnel believed that the Ukrainian army intended to conquer the Kharkov region, this was not the case. The Ukrainian General Staff ordered the 3,000-strong battalion to launch an offensive against Russian forces in the Kharkov region. The offensive objective of the Ukrainian army was to deploy HIMARS missiles to the territory they conquered and launch an operation against a Russian ammunition stockpile located within Russia's frontiers. Knowing that there were many Russian forces in the Kharkov region, the Ukrainian army resolved to take one of the small towns in the Kharkov border region rather than the city center. The Ukrainian army attacked the city of Myr-Efa in the vicinity of Kharkiv with a force of 3,000 soldiers to ascertain the number of Russian forces stationed in Myr-Efa. He embarked on a reconnaissance mission with a 7-member pioneer squad. An estimated 150 Russian soldiers were discovered by reconnaissance soldiers in abandoned buildings in the vicinity. In addition, the intervening Ukrainian army completely encompassed Myr-Efa. Having surrounded the buildings where the Russian personnel were stationed, Ukrainian forces began shelling them with the tanks they had brought. The Russian forces began to withdraw from the city, leaving the structure was defenseless against the Ukrainian tanks' artillery barrage. This intriguing Ukrainian victory may be the simplest victory the Ukrainian army has ever achieved. Following the evacuation of Russian troops from the town, the Ukrainian army commenced the main operation after the liberation of Myr-Efa from Russian occupation. The Dnipro-delivered HIMARS missiles were deployed there. The Ukrainian intelligence service informed Ukrainian forces of the location of the Russian headquarters in Belgorod, which contained the largest weapons storage facility for the Russian army. The HIMARS missile systems were programmed with the coordinates of the headquarters and the operation was initiated. 8 HIMARS missiles were launched in the direction of the Russian frontier. HIMARS missiles effectively struck the headquarters' ammunition storage while the Russian forces stationed there were unaware of the attack. As a consequence of a Ukrainian army air operation, the ammunition dump, the primary source of ammunition supplies delivered to Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, was destroyed, while 5 HIMARS missiles from the Ukrainian army struck the munitions depot. 3 were intercepted by Russian Panzers I air defense systems. Important, however, is the destruction of this ammunition storage facility in Belgorod, which will significantly diminish Russian forces in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military detonated a device at a Russian munitions depot in Belgorod, preventing Russia from transporting munitions to the Kharkiv region. This will make it easier for the Ukrainian army to conquer the Russian-occupied city of Kharkov. After conducting an air operation from Myr-Efa to the borders of Belgorod, the Ukrainian battalion promptly evacuated the city in case Russian forces attacked Myr-Efa without incurring any casualties. Ukrainian troops returned to Dnipro and destroyed the Russian army's major munitions depot. Since the beginning of the conflict, Ukrainian forces have launched airstrikes on Ukrainian territory against multiple Russian ammunition depots and military headquarters due to support from the United States and its allies. The Ukrainian army now has long-range missiles, whereas it did not have them in the early months of the conflict. Vladimir Putin has never shied away from employing long-range missiles on Ukrainian territory. The Russian military, which has been conducting airstrikes on Ukrainian territory with these missiles since the start of the conflict, is perpetrating war crimes by destroying several civilian areas in Ukraine as a consequence of Russian military assaults on Ukraine's energy and water infrastructure assets. Water and electricity have been out for days. The U.S. government initially opposed the delivery of long-range missiles to the Ukrainian military. Joe Biden did not transmit the missiles to the Ukrainian army early because he believed that the Ukrainian army's advance on Russia's borders would escalate the conflict. After Russian forces bombed multiple Ukrainian regions, however, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden authorized the delivery of HIMARS missiles and Patriot air defense systems to the Ukrainian military after the Ukrainian army began employing HIMARS missiles. The number of Russian airstrikes on Ukraine decreased significantly. Ukrainian state leader Volodymyr Zelensky intended to teach Russian forces a harsh lesson with the HIMARS missiles he obtained from the United States. Zelensky, who chose to organize an operation with these long-range missiles within Russian territory, targeted a Belgorod energy infrastructure complex using HIMARS missiles. The Ukrainian army effectively destroyed the electrical infrastructure complex, sending a strong message to Vladimir Putin. Zelensky demonstrated that the Ukrainian army can organize operations within Russian territory if it so chooses. He demonstrated that they no longer fear of Vladimir Putin's attacks. Zelensky, who has installed U.S.-supplied Patriot air defense systems in Kiev, is endeavoring to protect Kiev's citizens from Russian bombardment. However, the most intriguing event was Russia's decision following the transmission of HIMARS and Patriots to the Ukrainian military. President Putin has begun to increase security in Moscow out of concern that the Ukrainian army is planning an attack on the capital. Putin, who has installed Pantsir I air defense systems on the rooftops of government and other structures in Moscow, fears Ukrainian army attacks. Putin, who was relatively unconcerned when the Ukrainian army lacked HIMARS missiles, is now anxious that the Ukrainian army will respond. Vladimir Putin's installation of air defense systems on the rooftops of buildings has caused an uproar on social media websites. Images of rooftop air defense systems proliferated on the internet. The Ukrainian leader Zelensky then issued a statement in which he stated that the Ukrainian army will not attack the Russian people and that the Ukrainian army's conflict is with the Russian army. Zelensky also addressed Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine, imploring them to surrender to the Ukrainian army rather than perish for Vladimir Putin. In the Ukrainian parliament, Zelensky's words of consolation were received with a standing ovation. The president of Ukraine implores Russian forces to surrender at any cost. Since the start of the conflict, Russian soldiers engaging in Ukraine have suffered severe psychological damage. Russian soldiers who are unable to escape the battle are aware that they will be imprisoned within Russia's borders if they attempt to do so. Therefore, Russian soldiers would rather surrender to the Ukrainian army than escape the conflict.